September 12, 1940. Castle Bromwich, England. The rivet gun bucked in her hands, the pneumatic hiss drowning out the sounds of the factory floor around her. Mary Cartwright had been a seamstress 3 months ago. Now she was installing the starboard wing panel on a Spitfire that would fly combat missions over the Channel by week's end. Her hands ached, her ears rang, but the aluminum skin sealed perfectly, each rivet compressed to within 1/1000th of an inch of specification. Before we continue, if you're finding this story as remarkable as we did researching it, hit that like button and subscribe to keep these forgotten chapters of history alive. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Share this with anyone who appreciates the untold stories that changed the course of the war. 6 assembly lines away, another woman, a former shopkeeper from Birmingham, was threading hydraulic lines through the wing structure, her smaller hands reaching spaces male fitters had struggled with for years. Across Britain, in factories from Southampton to Glasgow, tens of thousands of women were performing industrial miracles that German intelligence had declared impossible. And in Berlin, in the offices of the Luftwaffe High Command, analysts were about to discover that they had built their entire invasion strategy on a catastrophic miscalculation. The confidence radiating from Berlin in early 1939 wasn't arrogance, it was mathematics. German intelligence had studied British aircraft manufacturing with methodical precision, and their conclusions seemed irrefutable. Britain's aviation industry employed approximately 350,000 skilled workers before the war. When conscription began, those factories would hemorrhage their most experienced craftsmen. The Luftwaffe's Economic Warfare Division projected a 70% collapse in British aircraft production within 18 months, not from bombing campaigns, but from simple arithmetic. They would watch Britain's industrial capacity implode under the weight of its own mobilization. The logic appeared unassailable. A single Spitfire required over 20,000 individual parts, each machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Wing assemblies demanded perfectly aligned rivet holes drilled through curved aluminum sections while maintaining aerodynamic precision. Engine installations required workers who understood torque specifications, thermal expansion, and the relationship between compression ratios and metal fatigue. This wasn't assembly line work that any untrained person could perform after a few days of instruction. German analysts knew that Britain's skilled tradesmen, the toolmakers, sheet metal workers, precision fitters, and instrument specialists, represented an irreplaceable resource built over decades. Albert Speer's office circulated internal memos treating British industrial collapse as inevitable. Their models showed monthly aircraft production falling below 400 units by mid-1941, less than half of Germany's output, and nowhere near what Britain would need. Some planners even suggested that bombing British factories was unnecessary. Why waste ordnance on targets that would soon stand empty anyway? The German assessment rested on an assumption so fundamental it appeared in no written report. Industrial production at this level of complexity required men. Not just any men, but men with years of training, men with the physical strength for heavy metal work, men with the temperament for precision engineering. In 1939, Germany's own armaments factories employed virtually no women in skilled positions. American aircraft plants followed the same pattern. Soviet factories used women primarily for basic assembly under male supervision. The international consensus held that modern warfare demanded industrial capacity that only male workers could provide. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong expertise could be. The National Service Act became law on September 3, 1939. The same day Britain declared war. Within 6 months, the theoretical problem German intelligence had identified became Britain's lived nightmare. Supermarine's Southampton Works lost 40% of its skilled fitters by March 1940. Vickers Armstrong in Weybridge watched 300 toolmakers leave for basic training in a single month. Hawker's Langley facility saw experienced sheet metal workers disappear into khaki uniforms faster than production managers could reorganize work schedules. By December 1940, Britain's aircraft workforce had dropped from 350,000 to 210,000, and those remaining skewed older, less experienced, or held reserved occupations. But conscription wasn't the only drain. Skilled tradesmen who'd avoided call-up faced impossible social pressures. Watching neighbors in uniform, reading casualty lists from Dunkirk, seeing newsreels of Spitfire pilots, it made staying at a workbench feel like cowardice. Between January and June 1940, Rolls-Royce's Merlin engine plants lost over 800 workers to voluntary enlistment, despite official exemptions. Meanwhile, production quotas moved in the opposite direction. In May 1940, with France collapsing, the Air Ministry demanded 2,300 aircraft monthly by year's end. The arithmetic was impossible. A single Wellington bomber required 28,000 hand-driven rivets. A Lancaster's wing assembly demanded 14-hour shifts of continuous precision work. The Merlin engines powering Hurricanes and Spitfires needed 70 hours of skilled machining just for the crankshaft. Lord Beaverbrook visited Castle Bromwich in July 1940 and found assembly jigs standing empty, tool cribs locked, and partially completed airframes sitting idle. The facility had been designed for 1,000 workers, but operated with only 320. By spring 1941, Britain needed 5,000 aircraft monthly. The available workforce could perhaps manage 1,500 if they worked themselves to collapse. German intelligence officers reading intercepted production reports must have felt vindicated. The British industrial base was collapsing exactly as predicted. What they didn't know was that Britain had already made a decision that would invalidate every assumption. Ernest Bevin, Minister of Labour and National Service, stood before Parliament on December 18, 1940, with a proposal that would have seemed unthinkable 18 months earlier. Britain would conscript women, not for auxiliary services or nursing, but for the factory floor for aircraft manufacturing, for the precise demanding work of building Spitfires and Lancasters. Bevin wasn't proposing this because he was progressive. He was proposing it because Britain had run out of alternatives. The Registration for Employment Order issued on March 19, 1941, required all women aged 18 to 60 to register at local employment exchanges. This wasn't voluntary recruitment. It was compulsory national service. The ministry projected they needed 700,000 women in engineering and aircraft production within 12 months. The existing female workforce in these industries stood at roughly 90,000, mostly in unskilled roles. Whitehall was proposing to increase that eightfold in a year. Employment exchanges interviewed registered women to assess their suitability for war work. Those deemed appropriate for aircraft manufacturing received summons, not invitations, summons. Housewives who hadn't worked outside their homes since marriage found themselves informed they'd be operating milling machines in 6 weeks. Shop assistants from Marks and Spencer learned they'd be fitting hydraulic systems into bomber tails. The ministry cast a net so wide, it captured nearly every woman without dependent children under 5. The ministry specifically sought women between 20 and 40, peak childbearing years in 1940s Britain. They recruited from shops because retail workers understood pressure and exacting standards. They pulled from textile mills because fabric workers understood machinery and possessed manual dexterity. Training centers needed establishing across the country, requiring requisitioned buildings, installed equipment, and instructors. Transport became its own crisis. Factories operated 3 shifts, meaning women working nights in industrial areas far from home. Women from Cornwall found themselves billeted in Coventry. Scottish women took lodgings in Southampton. And through all of this, one question dominated every discussion. Could this possibly work? Could women who'd never held a wrench build aircraft that would keep pilots alive? The resistance wasn't subtle. Trade union representatives from the Amalgamated Engineering Union stated their position bluntly. Women lacked the physical strength and technical aptitude for skilled engineering work. These were unions that had fought for workers' rights, men who now faced training female replacements. Their objections weren't rooted in malice but in generations of workshop experience. Factory foremen echoed these concerns with technical specificity. Driving rivets along a Lancaster's fuselage required sustained pressure on a pneumatic gun that vibrated violently enough to numb hands through thick gloves. Aircraft electrical systems contained hundreds of individual wire connections, each requiring stripping, crimping, and soldering to specifications measured in millimeters. One loose connection in a fuel pump circuit could leave a bomber with dead engines over the North Sea. Foreman questioned whether women possessed the spatial reasoning to visualize complex three-dimensional wiring runs, or the mechanical intuition to troubleshoot hydraulic systems. Even some pilots voiced doubts. Squadron leader Douglas Bader reportedly said he trusted his life to Spitfires built by men who understood flying. How could a housewife from Tunbridge Wells understand what it meant when a Merlin engine coughed at 12,000 feet? Medical professionals added concerns about industrial solvents affecting reproductive health, noise levels damaging supposedly sensitive hearing, shift work disrupting natural rhythms. Social commentators questioned broader implications. Magazine articles wondered whether women doing men's work would become coarsened, unwomanly, unable to return to domestic life. Yet beneath all these objections ran simple disbelief. Britain was proposing to take women with no engineering background and trust them to build some of the most sophisticated machines humanity had ever created. Every precedent suggested this would fail catastrophically. The government training centers didn't waste time on theory. When Mary Churchill arrived at the Sheffield Center in April 1941, she'd been a legal secretary the previous week. Her first morning began not with lectures about metallurgy, but with a rivet gun placed in her hands. The training philosophy was brutally simple: learn by doing, and do it until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. The 6-week courses rolling out across Britain weren't traditional apprenticeships compressed. They were entirely new approaches to skills transfer. Week 1 focused exclusively on tool familiarity. Trainees spent 8-hour days handling drill presses, operating lathes, using micrometers, feeling the difference between properly torqued bolts and loose ones. Instructors demonstrated techniques once, then watched while women repeated the action 50 times, 100 times, until their hands moved correctly without thinking. The centers discovered that women's supposedly delicate hands actually proved advantageous. Smaller fingers could reach into cramped cockpit assemblies where larger male hands struggled. Dexterity developed through years of sewing and knitting transferred directly to precision wire work. Week 2 introduced actual aircraft components. Training centers obtained damaged aircraft sections, Spitfire wing panels riddled with bullet holes, Hurricane fuselage frames bent from hard landings. Trainees learned to remove damaged rivets and install replacements on real aluminum. The tangible connection made the stakes visceral. Every rivet they learned to install correctly was a rivet that would keep a pilot alive. Weeks 3 and 4 focused on specialization. Women showing aptitude for electrical work moved to wiring harness assembly. Those with steady hands specialized in instrument installation, where a single millimeter's misalignment could render altimeters dangerously inaccurate. The training incorporated innovations traditional apprenticeships never considered. Visual aids replaced lengthy verbal explanations. Color-coded wiring diagrams showed connections more clearly. Assembly jigs were redesigned to require technique rather than brute strength. Week 5 meant production simulation under pressure. Trainees worked against stopwatches, assembling components to actual factory quotas. They learned to spot fatigue and correct errors before they became problems. The failure rate was roughly 20%, but the 80% who succeeded emerged certified after 42 days. By the end of 1941, government training centers were processing over 12,000 women monthly. The training wasn't producing master craftsmen, but it was producing competent specialists who could perform specific operations to aircraft manufacturing standards. And Britain needed hundreds of thousands of them. The first Spitfire, assembled entirely by a predominantly female crew, rolled out of Castle Bromwich on July 14, 1941. Flight Lieutenant Hugh Dundas climbed into the cockpit that afternoon and took off without incident. He later wrote that he'd been watching for any sign of assembly problems. The aircraft performed flawlessly. Within 6 months, Castle Bromwich employed over 10,000 women, producing 500 Spitfires monthly, more than the entire British aircraft industry had managed in any month before the war. The production figures emerging by mid-1942 made German intelligence reports look like fantasy. Supermarines' dispersed facilities, staffed predominantly by women, produced 8,348 Spitfires between 1940 and 1945. Avro's Manchester and Chatterton works, where women constituted 75% of the workforce by 1943, assembled 7,377 Lancaster bombers. De Havilland's plants built 7,181 Mosquito aircraft with work teams that shifted from male-dominated to female-dominated between 1941 and 1943. At Hawker's Langley facility, women built 9,200 Hurricanes while simultaneously handling production of the temperamental Typhoon ground attack fighter. Short Brothers facilities producing Sterling and Sunderland aircraft presented particular challenges. The Sterling bomber stood over 6 meters tall with a wingspan exceeding 30 meters, requiring work at height on scaffolding and installing 4 engines weighing over 800 kilograms each. Yet by 1943, women formed the majority of workers on Sterling production lines. The numbers accumulated relentlessly. 1941, 20,194 aircraft. 1942, 23,672 aircraft. 1943, 26,263 aircraft. The peak came in 1944 with 26,261 aircraft, more than Germany produced that year despite their larger industrial base. By war's end, British factories had produced over 120,000 military aircraft. Women had directly assembled at least 75% of them. German intelligence's prediction of a 70% production decline had been inverted. Production had increased 700% instead. Production numbers told only half the story. Women weren't merely replicating men's work methods. They were improving them. At Vickers Armstrong's Weybridge facility in September 1942, a production bottleneck had stalled Wellington bomber output for 3 weeks. The geodetic structure required sections to align within 2 millimeters across the entire airframe, taking 14 hours per aircraft with 4 experienced fitters working simultaneously. Dorothy Russell, a former primary school teacher from Guildford, watched for 2 days and suggested something engineering staff had never considered. Instead of 4 workers coordinating adjustments verbally across 10 meters of airframe, why not use visual reference points? She proposed painting alignment marks on internal structure at critical junctures. The engineering team initially dismissed it as oversimplification, but assembly time dropped to 9 hours. By November, every Wellington facility in Britain had adopted the technique. Similar innovations emerged across the industry. At Castle Bromwich, women noticed Spitfire wing panels occasionally arrived with rivet holes slightly misaligned, requiring time-consuming corrections. Male supervisors had treated this as normal variance. A quality control team of women suggested implementing go-no-go gauges at the subcontractor level. Within 6 weeks, misalignment issues virtually disappeared, and assembly time per aircraft dropped by 3 hours. In Lancaster bombers, intermittent navigation lighting failures plagued operations. Male engineers had spent months checking specifications without finding the cause. In January 1943, electrical fitter Margaret Dobson noticed problems occurred more frequently on aircraft assembled during night shifts. She hypothesized that tired workers were pinching wires between airframe sections during assembly. Her solution: route wiring harnesses through protective rubber grommets at every bulkhead penetration. Night lighting failures dropped by 92% within 3 months. The Luftwaffe's strategic planning had always relied on mathematics. Operations research teams calculated that if they could destroy British aircraft faster than factories replaced them, fighter command would wither. The strategy appeared sound in July 1940. Shoot down 6 Spitfires today and tomorrow only 4 replacements arrive. Continue that equation for 3 months and the RAF ceases to exist. Hermann Göring confidently predicted fighter command's collapse by October 1940. The first cracks in German confidence appeared in September 1940. Luftwaffe intelligence estimated they'd destroyed over 1,000 RAF fighters between July and early September. Fighter command should have been operating with skeleton squadrons. Yet every raid encountered full-strength opposition. German pilots began questioning whether British factories possessed capabilities intelligence had missed. The actual figures revealed the truth. During the critical phase between August and October 1940, Fighter Command lost 915 aircraft to all causes. British factories delivered 1,581 replacement fighters during the same period, a net gain of 666 aircraft. The Luftwaffe wasn't losing the attrition battle. They were never in it. For every British fighter destroyed, factories produced nearly 2 replacements. Women working night shifts were outproducing the entire Luftwaffe combat force. The pattern intensified. During the 1941 Blitz, Luftwaffe bombers faced fighter opposition that should have been severely depleted. Instead, squadron strength remained constant. When Bomber Command launched its strategic campaign in 1942, Germans anticipated losses would force the British to scale back. By 1943, Bomber Command was losing 50 bombers some nights. Yet raid sizes kept growing. Women were building Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Sterlings faster than German defenses could destroy them. German fighter pilots over the Reich found themselves in a nightmare. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke wrote in March 1944 that he'd claimed 11 bomber kills that month. Yet formation seemed larger than ever. The psychological impact was devastating. Every mission succeeded tactically. Bombers shot down, crews killed. Yet strategically nothing changed. The British kept coming because the bombers overhead were being replaced faster than German industry could replace the fighters defending against them. The Normandy invasion illustrated the culmination. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties with fewer than 100 losses. The Luftwaffe managed under 300 sorties the entire day. German pilots weren't cowards. They were outnumbered because British factories had spent 4 years producing aircraft at rates that made numerical superiority inevitable. German attrition strategy had been sound. The problem was that British factories, staffed predominantly by women, had made attrition mathematically impossible. Victory in Europe was declared on May 8, 1945. By August, with Japan's surrender, the factories began shutting down assembly lines. The women who'd built over 100,000 aircraft received their redundancy notices with remarkable speed. Castle Bromwich dismissed 7,000 within 3 months. The Ministry of Labor encouraged women to return to domestic life, and government propaganda pivoted overnight to promoting homemaking as patriotic duty. The speed of this reversal was staggering. Women who'd been praised for their precision found themselves described as temporary workers who could now step aside for returning servicemen. Trade unions lobbied for policies prioritizing male employment. The Restoration of Pre-War Practices Act essentially mandated that women surrender skilled positions. By 1947, women's participation in aircraft manufacturing had dropped below pre-war levels. The women who'd revolutionized British industrial capacity simply vanished from factory floors.